folks in. Oops, thank you. Whoever did that, Kim, maybe. So this morning I just wanted to, we were going to go over the buyer contingency addendum. Right now, I can tell you, I am seeing a ton of these come through. A lot of contingencies happening and a lot of kind of strange scenarios, because with that contingency, oftentimes you don't know. There's just a lot of unknowns that can happen. You don't know when it's going to sell, if it's a house that's just been put on the market. You know, and with the market the way it is, everything's a little bit more unpredictable than normal. So I wanted to start and point out a couple of things, as particularly those who are newer, that are a little different on the buyer contingency addendum versus some of the other terms in the regular purchase, in the bulk of the purchase contract. And the biggest one is, well, I'm going to back up. Sorry, let me back up. Let me share my screen and put this on here so that you guys can actually see what I'm talking about. And I don't know why it's not. Oh, there we go. Can you guys see that now? The contingency addendum?
Yes.
Okay. You guys know me. I'm not as techie as everybody else here. So, so this first section, so section 7 through 48, lines 47 through 48, that is intended for when a buyer still has a house that needs to sell. It's not under contract yet. So maybe they haven't listed it yet, or they're just listing it and it still has not sold. So the biggest thing in this section that I always want to point out, and that is a little bit different, this is the part I was going to talk about that's a little bit different than the rest of the contract, is that if you look at lines 10 and 11 here, the way that reads is that property doesn't sell by the date that's listed on line 10, the contract is deemed canceled. So unlike the rest of the contract, where there's oftentimes a few days built in for different things, like the cure notice, where you can get 3 days to make it right, if you will. This contract, or this part of the contract, says if their house has not sold by that date, it is canceled, period, the end, the whole thing. So, and earnest money goes back to the buyer. So what I would always tell you is make sure you include plenty of time, ample time. Provide extra. If you think it's going to sell in 30 days, make that date 60 days. Give yourself enough time if you're representing a buyer, obviously. On the next part of that is that once the buyer's house sells, then you have this date on line 21. And what I often see when I'm reviewing files is that date is left blank, but that date needs to mirror, most likely, I'm going to say, needs to mirror the actual close of escrow date in the offer itself. Does that make sense? So if your house is, if we're going to say the closing is March 30th, the house needs to sell by March 10th, or let's say, but it needs to close by March 30th on line 21. Now, again, it's by that date. So if there's a concern that date might need an extension, or you think that you might potentially need more time, I would say bump that date out. Again, 30 days, 60 days, whatever it is, because again, as soon as it hits and something doesn't happen, the contract, again, on line 22 there, or this form says it's deemed canceled. It's done as of that date. That does not mean, though, that you can't do an addendum to change that. If once you get that house on the market and you're still negotiating and you're up against that date and you might not have it under contract yet, bump it out, get an addendum that everybody signs to extend that if you need to. I think it's one of the pieces that gets missed, particularly for newer folks. It's kind of that surprise that date hit and now it's canceled, and nobody quite realized that that's what happened, because it's one of the few automatic provisions for that. Another thing that is a little bit confusing in this section that a lot of agents don't realize is that it builds in this time frame for once the buyer's house has that offer and you submit that I'm talking from the buyer's agent standpoint here. You submit those offer documents to the seller. The seller has 3 days to review those and to accept it or disapprove them and cancel. And that the reason that's in there, the intention behind that language and those provisions is that it allows the seller to confirm if that offer that the buyer has accepted on their other home is valid and will work with the terms of the current offer. Meaning, what happens if the buyer sells their house and there's another contingency? Or what happens if it looks a little shaky, or there's some kind of red flag, there's some kind of strange provisions in there that the seller isn't comfortable with, and they don't feel like it's really a good, solid contract. We also, unfortunately, it's in there because, a few bad eggs kind of spoil the whole, but what has potentially happened in the past is, they'll have their brother-in-law write an offer on their house just to kind of buy some time, if you will. So, you really want to have the seller has the opportunity to vet that contract, make sure they're comfortable with that contingency before it's approved. And they have 3 days to do so. And does that make sense to everyone? Is that?
Got a quick question for you.
Sure.
So if you get an offer on a home and you have to write the buyer's contingency, do you still go through your 10-day, 5-day, 5-day? I mean, do you do all that up front, or do you wait until end of closing?
So this next section, lines 42 to 48, can you guys all see that right here? These only apply for that first section when they don't have their house sold yet. What this says is there are 2 options. One is the date the signed contract, that the contract is signed, is the date that's used forward, just like a normal contract scenario. So all your inspection periods, everything start day 1. Okay. The second one, however, says they start 3 days after seller's receipt of the offer documents, meaning nothing starts until the buyer has sold their house, submitted it to the seller. The seller has that 3 days to approve, then it starts the inspection periods and all contract dates. The only difference to any of that is that if you look on line 42, right at the end here, it says excluding opening of escrow and deposit of earnest money. That starts immediately, no matter what.
Okay.
So depending on which one you choose there, it's a negotiable item. It seems to be a heated item. I for lack of a better way to say it, I feel like it's the one piece where I've had agents get in, a little bit of a negotiating match with the seller's agent on those lines there, because as a seller's agent, you want to start those right away, know that you've got the inspection items out of the way so that once the buyer has sold their house, you're ready to just keep moving forward and save that time. On the buyer's side, there's some risk in that because they're going to be putting out the money for those inspections and things. And what happens if they don't get their house sold in time, or the seller doesn't approve that contract within those 3 days. So that, that's important to pay attention to. I see sometimes where that's also left blank, even when this first section applies. Another piece that's a little bit misunderstood in this form is that once that buyer's house sells, let me say this a different way. The second section here on page 2, from lines 49 to 79, those apply when the buyer has already sold their house. So they're already under contract. They're just waiting for it to close. They want to, get this other offer and have another house contingent on that sale. This part of the contract is only filled out in that scenario. Once the buyer on this first section has sold their house, some people think that then they have to go fill out the second section. It's not necessary. The form is designed so that it's either they need to sell or they have sold. And those are the only 2 sections you need to worry about. Each section in and of themselves address everything that's needed in those scenarios. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I know I feel like I'm talking in circles a little bit because there's a lot of moving pieces. Another piece that's really important here is that line 67 through 72, I oftentimes will see these left blank. And again, in those ones, this is what I think there should be more added. And here's why. This says that once the buyer has got an accepted offer, they submit it to the seller. This is what they have to submit. So what are they submitting? Are they sending just the purchase contract, which is what this says without anything else filled out? But as a seller's agent, wouldn't you want to see the pre-qual, the proof of funds, some of those other things to, again, vet that contract and make sure it's actually viable and potentially gonna close? Because again, what if all of a sudden you get that pre-qual and someone's checked the box that contingency, but you didn't see it in the offer? Those kind of things can come up, and it's really important you're looking at if you're on the seller side of things, you're looking at all of those documents very carefully and vetting that other contingency contract. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right. Some other things that, let me think, what other questions or scenarios has anybody had anything that you have a question about or a scenario that you're not sure about on this form?
Do we have to use this form? I hate it.
I know.
It's so complicated. Why can't we just?
It is. And they tried to revise it. And honestly, last October, they went through a draft and it didn't change enough to make it any easier.
Well, the verbiage we used to use was so simple and clear and to the point, right?
Yeah.
Nate's shaking his head no.
I mean, I think what would make it easier to me personally, and I don't know about you guys, is if they just made it two separate forms. There's buyer needs to sell their house, or buyer has already sold their house. I feel like having them on the same form is where everybody kind of gets hung up in the language and which one applies and which parts and all of that. I feel like if they just separated them, maybe that would make it a little easier on everyone. But this is what we have. And I do feel like it does cover all of the scenarios and some of the reasons behind it. When you read further into some of the intentions when they're drafting these forms and things, the reason for things like the provision to be an automatic cancellation is because unlike some of the other things in the contract, a contingency either happens or it doesn't. So it's just, it's there or it isn't. And that's why it's an automatic provision for a cancellation if those dates aren't met. So that's why I say just bump them out. If you're representing a buyer, just bump them out as long as you can and keep track of them so that if you're running up against them, you can amend them in enough time or negotiate that out if you need to.
Shannon, you have a question in the chat. Can you address box 44 and 46, which is better?
44 or 46, which is better is subjective. It depends on which side you're on always. So 44 would be more advantageous for a seller because again, the buyer would be starting their inspection periods and their financing contingents. Everything starts from day one, essentially. So for a seller, of course, that would make more sense or be advantageous because they would get those inspection negotiations and all those things out of the way. So by the time the buyer's house sells, they can just move forward and close. The second 46, again, would be more advantageous and need more coffee this morning, guys. Advantageous for the buyer because again, they're not going to be out those funds and all of that time and energy until they know their house is sold and they're actually moving forward. Nate, you raised your hand. You have a question?
Yeah. You have to be really careful on this one. I recommend the second because we just had a contingency the other day and learning this form is so important. And thank you, Shannon, for taking the time to teach it to us because it is a really good form, but you have to really understand the terms. As an example, we checked the second box. Well, within 2 or 3 days, the seller got a backup offer. And once you get a backup offer in this upper level, why don't you explain a little bit about that, Shannon, because I think that is key.
Yes. Okay. So in this first section, the seller here on lines 33 through 41 has the opportunity to accept backup offers. And that's true. Any contract, a seller can accept backup offers. In this case, however, they have the opportunity, if they accept one, they may It's not required. They can just keep it as a backup. Or if it's potentially a better offer, or maybe it's cash or not contingent, they can serve your buyer, if you're representing the buyer, notice to say, you have basically 3 days to remove the contingency altogether, or you're getting bumped and I'm moving forward with this other contract. So it does allow the seller to solicit those backups. It does allow the seller to potentially deliver notice to say, you have 3 days to remove that contingency altogether, or to cancel and move on. And I'm moving on with this other offer.
Shannon, also
Yeah.
in the, excuse me, also in the next phase, if you're using the bottom, all they can do is have a backup offer. They can't force you out of the contract like the top half does, correct?
Right. True, correct. Does that make sense what he's
So
saying
the
here,
bottom
right?
section is that they've already sold their home, so
Yeah.
that would make sense.
Yes. So the seller
And-
can accept backup offers. They just don't have the opportunity to bump you and have you remove that contingency as a buyer.
And
What
the
if-
bottom half will automatically, correct me if I'm wrong, kick into the normal terms of the contract, i.e. the 10-day inspection period and all the other timelines.
Yes,
So you don't have a choice there.
yes, correct.
Okay, so you got a question, is there a form to use to deliver a bump notice? And then Leslie's just confirming that what you were talking about, the 3 days is the right of refusal.
Yes,
It's our old language.
yeah, yes. So the 3 days, it essentially, if the seller delivers 3 days notice that they've accepted an offer that they intend to move forward with, unless your buyer goes and removes that contingency. It's one or the other, and it's done. The notice form, when any time in the contract, not just this form, but any time in the contract, it identifies that notice is required by a party. It's this form here, and I don't, can you guys see that one yet? Did it come up?
Not
Gotcha.
yet.
Okay, let me try and change my share here. Let me try this again.
And Mary has her hand up when you're ready. Well,
Okay.
she took it down.
It's this notice and disclosure form here. And this, I pulled it, it says buyer notice. I don't know if you can see that at the top, but it's actually a buyer or seller notice. It just, this one happens to be, so it autofills with the signatures for a buyer, but you can choose the seller side. It's the exact same form. So anytime in any part of the contract, it requires a notice to be delivered or a new disclosure, this would be the form you use. And it's just signed by the party that's delivering that notice. And this is fairly new. You can see it just came out in 2019, but it still feels like a new form because they've never had anything like that before.
So
And
that
here-
would be the same form you'd use to remove your contingency then?
Yes.
Got it.
Yep. And you would just spell it out, per lines of whatever, of the contingency addendum, buyer is hereby delivering notice of they're removing their contingency and intending to move forward without the contingency of the sale of their home or whatever or if you're on the seller side, you're delivering notice saying, buyer, you now have 3 days to remove your contingency or to cancel. I'm moving forward with a different one. Does that make
Shannon,
sense?
I would,
Someone else had a question?
I would note that if you're going to change the date on the contingency to extend the contingency period, do not use this, use a normal addendum.
Addendum. Yes,
Is
a
that
notice
right?
is just putting someone on alert. It's a notice for, an addendum is going to change the terms of the agreement. So actually, yeah. Actually,
And Mary- did
amending
Mary-
the contract.
Mary, did you have a question? You put your hand up.
You answered it.
Okay.
All right. Let me pull this back up again really quick. One of the things, Nate, maybe you can touch on this and share, but recently that where you had a client was confused that if they sold they were under the buyer was under the impression that if they received that notice from the seller and they had the 3 days, they were under the impression they could simply sell their property as long as it went under contract, that they would have fulfilled that piece. And that's not necessarily true. they actually have to remove the entire contingency, meaning they have to show that they can actually move forward and either pay cash or get financing, otherwise that they don't need to have the sale of that home help them qualify, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. There was one piece I wanted to point out, you guys bear with me, I'm gonna look, I had notes here. Well, and another piece that gets, a lot of folks, like I said, a lot of confusion surrounding that seller's opportunity to review that contract. And it does leave the buyer exposed. I mean, it does, but it's for the protection of everyone.
Hey, Shannon,
Yes,
one of the things that Workman Success Systems has put together is a verified contingency sales system. In this system, and we can train on this at a later date, but it's very good information. It has a checklist for the buyer, a checklist for the seller. This might be good to also put in with the offers, down at the bottom of it, where you put all the different contracts in for the seller to review, to have something that is so clean. And I think we should try to do a class just on using this system, because there's scripts for buyer side, scripts for seller side, checklist for buyers, checklist for sellers. Contingencies are a big deal now, and Workman has kind of got with, several top real estate agents across the country. I know Sarah's been involved in creating some of these as well, where it really helps define and put you in a more professional light, if you will, when dealing with contingencies. Because if you're representing a seller, most sellers don't want to accept a contingency. So if you can explain it to them properly, show them a checklist, show them a process, they might feel better. Vice versa, on the other side of the transaction, a buyer may not want to move forward because they don't really understand the process.
correct.
So we could do a follow-up class just on that information.
Yeah, that would be great, because it's a lot. You're set. If you're a buyer's agent and you have to get their house sold, you need to make sure that listing is in the very best light, because an agent is going to look that up. They should be, if you're on the seller side, you should be looking at the MLS, you should be looking at the comps for that house. You should be making sure it's not horribly overpriced, or there's way too much inventory, or maybe some really big red flags with the condition of the property. Those are the kind of things that as a seller's agent, you're going to be looking at on that contingency property to make sure it's going to sell, and that it's truly a viable option for them to sell it. Another piece of that similarly is what happens if they get it under contract and now that contract cancels. That contingency offer cancels, maybe in their inspection period or whatever the situation is. So these lines 24 to 30 and 55 to 63 all address that. And it essentially says that if buyer's offer cancels for any reason, buyer shall deliver notice. They have to immediately deliver notice within 3 days of receipt of the cancellation and provide evidence of it. And then they have the election to either immediately cancel and get their earnest money back, or proceed without the contingency. And I'm just reading really quick. And they have to provide that documentation that they can proceed without the contingency. So that's the same in both sections if that buyer's offer happens to cancel. So that's what we're saying, where lines 7 through 48, once their house is under contract, it still addresses what happens all the way through to closing. You don't have to go down and refill out this section once it's under contract.
I would probably give a tip if you're representing a seller and this document comes across your desk in an offer, that you go in and do some due diligence, right? You're going to take that address, go into MLS, number one, see if it's listed, see if it's pending or what have you. It's either going to be listed or maybe it has an offer. Then you need to go in and find out all the information about that. You want to make sure, does that offer have a contingency? right? And is
Right.
the offer that has a contingency, is that sold or not sold yet, right? You need to really do some due diligence before you get your seller to tie up their house on a contingency like this. It can go pretty deep. You want to maybe do some quick comps to make sure if it hasn't sold, is it priced right? Right? Or is that seller pricing it up here and you're going to be tied up because the seller is never going to sell the house at that price and you're just wasting time. You want to check the marketing. You just want to see what the other agent is doing and go as
Check
deep
the
as
names.
possible. Pardon me?
Checking the names, making sure that the names that are on tax records are what you don't want is there's an ex-spouse or somebody out there who still needs to potentially sign off and they're not on that listing or available, or, there's a lot of factors there. That's line 67 through 72, Nate. That's what I was referring to, is making sure you include all of the documentation you want to see on the seller side to be able to vet that offer and that
Correct.
other listing. Yeah, it's really important. Calling the other lender, you get a pre-qual on that contingency. Why would you not vet that the same as you would from the buyer who's actually submitting your offer? You want to treat it as if it's just as important.
A couple things on this workman checklist, which is quite interesting. Let's assume that house hasn't sold yet, right?
Mhm.
The contingency home. You can ask the agent how many showings they've had, since it's been listed. How many offers have they had, if they've had any? Go out and preview the house yourself, not just look at it online, So just some ways to really represent your client. What this system does, it tries to create a certification, if you will, that you've kind of done all these things so you can make your seller feel good that, yeah, they should move forward and accept this contingency.
Mhm.
And there's like 11 things on this checklist.
Mary, so Mary has her hand up again.
Mhm.
Mary, I think there you go.
Yeah, well, the first thing I was going to say is it's kind of a win-win situation in a way, because of lines 33 through 39. But I did have one contract come across and where the buyer's agent put down on the additional terms, lines 33 through 39 shall be deleted. So the seller couldn't cancel on them if they
Mhm.
got a backup offer, even if they got a backup offer, making it somewhat same as a regular offer,
Yeah,
which is kind of scary. So
yeah.
that was a good. And then another thing I've seen is where agents are leaving it active in the MLS when they have a contingency, which is not,
No. So MLS and armless rules say that you do have to, even if you have a contingency offer like this, you do have to notate that it is under contract and either accepting backup offers or contingent on the sale. I mean, there is an actual UCCB? I forget what all the UCCB, I think it is the one where it's essentially saying that they have an offer that's contingent on the sale of the buyer's home, or just under contract taking backups. But yes, you do have to make that change, no matter what.
Yeah.
Yeah, or it's a
But
potential.
other than, I can't see where, well, I guess it's not a win-win in that once it goes under the, is it CCBS?
Is that what it is?
Yeah, status on the MLS, people
Mhm.
are less likely to show it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But people will show it, especially the listing agent, right? And they're going to encourage a backup because if they can, like what happened to me last week was the other agent, tendered a cash offer and we were out, right? So it's still beneficial. But yeah, if real estate agents don't understand what those acronyms mean, they may not show it, right? And so you have to be aware of that. So that's why when you take a house off the market on a contingency, it better be a pretty strong offer, right?
Right. And it's a good tip for your buyer's agents. If you have a buyer's looking in a specific neighborhood for a specific type of property and you see one in there that's under CC, Mary, what was it, CCBS or it's worth potentially digging into that. Call that listing agent and say, how strong is the property already sold? Is it just if it's still waiting, how much time? Start asking all those questions, because it might very well be worth submitting an offer on those ones and bumping that first one if you can make yours stronger.
I closed a deal up here in Prescott Valley doing that. It was under contract and we bumped buyer. They had a house in California that they had listed. It was not under contract. So it does work.
Is there another?
So the exact acronyms is CCBS, contract contingent on buyer sell.
Thank
And
you.
then UCB is under contract accepting backups.
Right.
Does anybody have any questions on what those mean? Are you really clear what UCB and CCBS is?
Does everybody know what those are? Yeah, okay.
We're Remax professionals.
Are there
Thanks,
any
Kitty.
other like specific scenarios or questions that you guys have that you run into, any confusion otherwise in what we've covered here?
Shannon, I'll just say this again. When we use this document the other day, and again, I've been doing this for 36 years, I wasn't 100% clear on the document. I went back to my old memory from old documents and assumed that. Make sure you read through the document. The agent that we had the cross sell with on this deal, is a strong agent. Been in business, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. Is a big producer. When they got the backup, the email that came to us, this is the first time in my career I really don't know what to do, So it's not something that's used a lot. So it's not just on the top of your head. Please read the document. Make sure your client knows exactly what's going on. And before you tie up a property, so I know we're working on one right now on a custom build. Just listening again, maybe we need to slow down with our seller. They're in Hawaii, not get them to sign something without us really maybe having a consultation and making sure they understand what they're signing.
It's really important to set those expectations on both sides, no matter who you're representing in these scenarios. And I would encourage you guys, I'll resend it, but in my broker blast recently about this form, I included the FAQs that AAR has put out. And I think they really break down, and I don't have them pulled up. I should have had those pulled up so I could show you guys, but I'll resend them if you want copies. But on aaronline.com, they have these FAQs, and it basically says what happens if, what does this mean? What does this mean? So if nothing else, just keep that in your system ready on hand on your laptop, whatever it is. So as your clients have questions, you can kind of refer back to these random scenarios, because that's the confusing part of all this, is that there's a lot of what ifs. And the form tries to cover all of those, but you just don't know until you run into the situation which part's going to apply, if that makes sense. So
You had Leslie just made a comment in the chat that aren't most sellers likely to take a contingency for a buyer that's already got their house under contract. And I would agree that that's a stronger offer than an offer where the buyer still has to sell their home.
yeah, agreed. But I'm seeing a lot that are still needing a house to sell and sellers accepting them. I've seen a lot lately. So
well, there's really no risk. You're still sitting other offers. It's
right.
Really no risk. Danielle, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Oh, just wanted to remind everybody the power of reminders, and Stephanie will set a Google event like, hey, 2-3 days before this is about to expire, or whatever dates we put on this contingency, she'll just let me know like, hey, what's going on. So that's a very professional thing to do. It keeps everybody on track, and it takes the pressure off trying to remember everything, whether you have one sale going or 5.
Right.
so just use your Google calendars or however, whatever system to set reminders for
Yeah.
these dates.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And there are so many different deadlines that are happening. It's when do they get their house under contract? Did you receive notice for this? And it's 3 days for that. If it's the inspection period, when does it start? I mean, there's a lot of pieces to keep track of, and having that on a calendar or as you said, Danielle, having just reminders set for yourself. It's critical because again, those dates, they don't allow for a whole lot of error on these. And I'm sure Nate, Mary, some of you who've been around a while, you guys have seen, I've seen transactions where they were 5, 6 deep in some cases. So you got a house in New York and a house in Illinois and a house in California that all are, it's that domino effect, and you are effectively managing 4 or 5 transactions potentially. And you're doing all the same due diligence as an agent to vet all of those offers all the way back to make sure there's not going to be a.
Shannon, I had a contingency going back a little bit, but you said the right word, New York, right?
Yes.
When you look at a contract from New York, and I don't expect any of us to know each state's laws and contracts, and they're very difficult to read, right? Because you're trying to go through. But in states like New York, and there's various other states where they're attorney states, they don't even have a close of escrow on their documents. And it's really weird because the attorney has to, all these different levels of attorney involvement.
Right.
The close of escrow date floats in New York. It's really weird. So you just got to be careful, when you're getting a contingency when somebody's from another state. I mean, you got to be careful if it's from next door, but
Right.
it gets more difficult when you have different states, different state forms.
Right. And reviewing those state forms and really reading them, because they have so many different provisions that we're not familiar with, Donna's on this call. I don't know if she wants to speak to the New York piece, but that's a great point, Nate, is
100.
that.
New York always has a date written to close, but they never, I can 100% agree, you never close on time. And it could close later, 2 weeks later. It doesn't matter to them because it's an attorney state. And unless you serve some kind of a notice to them, they don't care. You could close a month later.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
that
and
sounds fun.
that's what we encountered because, you think about it, if you have a close of escrow date here for the 30th of April, and the house in New York says there's a closing of the 20th in April, and your people pack up because they thinking everything's going to be great and hire a mover, and that gets extended as she was mentioning to whenever, you have people in limbo, and what you have is a very pissed off seller.
Yep.
Because they've encountered cost, and maybe the house that they're buying now is at risk, or
Yep.
they bought without contingency. Now they have a vacant home.
Right. Right. Great points. Great points.
It
And
makes you want to go out and do a contingency right now.
right.
Oh my gosh.
The local ones are a little easier because again, you can look at the comps, you can look at a little more information and really have a better feel and be familiar with that contract to see all those random provisions, Anything else on this particular form you guys want me to cover or that you've run into, you have questions about? Is everybody pretty clear on it?
I would just add another thing. Make sure you always call the other agent and have a conversation.
What?
Yeah, what a concept, right? So many times we get an offer with don't even know what's coming, right? And then there's an offer, you might want to have a conversation, start building a little rapport before you write the offer, while you're writing the offer, and when you send the offer, because, the offer could sit in somebody's email box, and there's a large percent of our realtor population that have real jobs during the day, and they may not even look at it till they get home at night.
Could go to their junk mail too.
Yeah,
Right.
good.
Yeah, agreed. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second.
We had, while Shannon, while you're getting that going, we have one of our agents that was a brand new agent. One of their first transactions, the list, and this is a pretty prominent listing agent that if I said the name, y'all would be like, oh yeah. And the entire transaction, not one time did they have a conversation on the phone. Everything was text and email. And this new agent was pretty like frustrated because they were new, right? Like one of their first transactions they were doing, and everything was done via email and text. So it's yeah.
Yeah.
I guess from a CYA perspective, right? You got everything documented, but at the same time, like it was very frustrating to them just because they had, wanted to have a human interaction with this person. So,
Right. So one other thing before I'm going to touch on just a couple of the random forms in just a minute here, but keep in mind also, you guys, if you're representing buyers, there are a lot of new options out there to put a buyer in a position to back them up as a contingent offer, meaning that they, there's Nate, you might remember more of the names than I have. But I know, for example, my son, when he bought in another state, there was a company called Ribbon that backed his offer as a cash offer. So effectively, even though he may have been contingent, they were willing to step in and pay cash if that, if he had needed a house to sell and it hadn't sold, that kind of thing. So there are companies out there and there are loan programs out there. So, talking to your lenders and making sure they've explored all possibilities before submitting a contingency like that, or having those things in the background as a backup to be able to tell a seller's agent, look, we need to sell this house. However, we've got this plan if it doesn't sell, might obviously, keep you in the game versus a seller who might say, I'm out, I'm going to move on to the next offer. So, explore those things because there's a lot more out there than there used to be for that. The other random forms that I'm just going to mention, because we're down to about 9:45 here, that seem to be missed or forgotten is one is, and I've mentioned this on Broker Blast a couple of times, when there is a tenant in place in a property. So it goes under contract, there's a tenant, maybe they've been given notice, maybe they haven't, maybe the buyer is buying it as an investment property and they're keeping that tenant, which either way, what I would recommend is using the residential income property addendum. And a lot of times folks think, and I'm going to pull it up here and show you guys this form. The confusion on this one tends to be that when it says 1 to 4 units, everybody kind of thinks multi, duplexes, triplexes, that sort of thing. It is 1 to 4. Meaning if it's occupied by a tenant, you really should be trying to use this form in those scenarios every single time. And the reason is it covers what happens to rents, deposits, how are they transferred, are there property managers, because maybe you're waiting for things from them, the lease documents, when they have to be provided, all of that information. And sometimes we just, I see a lot of contracts where they're just writing these things into the additional terms of the purchase contract. But you actually have a form that helps you with all of this and outlines it. And you literally can just go through, read it, and check the boxes and make sure everybody's covered on what's going to happen at close of escrow with those monies. So I would just encourage you, I see a lot of them a lot of contracts not using this, but I would encourage you to use it when you can. The other part of this is that there is a secondary piece to it. I'm going to share really quick. I'm just running through these real fast. I think that's the right one. There we go. That there's a seller's disclosure statement separate when it's an income property. Again, 1 tenant or, up to 4 units. That the seller should be filling this out, or the, property manager helping the seller, depending on the situation. But it answers a lot of questions that oftentimes buyers don't realize they really need to know. So again, I feel like these forms just are forgotten. So I'm bringing them up for that reason. The other ones that I'm going to mention really quick, how about the solar addendum? I still get questions on that one. Does anyone have anything in particular? I'm going to share one scenario that's happened recently that I want to make everyone aware of if there are no questions. The solar addendum allows, maybe I'll pull it up so I can reference the lines here.
Yeah, I think you should go through the solar addendum in maybe detail.
Okay, well, and this one's a whole, potentially, I mean, we know there's classes about solar altogether, but that first section is obviously, if you guys can see that, seller owned or utility owned. You know, APS has this program where they put up solar on a house and it's their solar, not the owner of the property doesn't own it. They're basically just using it and they get a little bit of a credit on their bill. That's a new program that's out there and that's come up a lot. So this is for if it's owned or utility owned. Second section being if it's a lease or something that they have to qualify for. You have your additional terms that apply to either section. And then your initials and due diligence period here. This part on line 73 to 80 is the part I want to talk about really quick. For both sections, the buyer has a due diligence period to review those lease documents, warranties, all of these things, utility bills, making sure how much they're going to be paying, who takes care of what, all of the things that can come up. We had a recent scenario where the solar was owned. So they used this first section here, lines 14 to 22. But what happened was everybody thought easy peasy. They were just, you know, transferring it over to the new buyer when they don't owe anything more on it. It's all good to go. However, when the buyer called to transfer the warranty, the solar company explained that the warranty could only be transferred if there was an inspection prior to close. Well, what happens if that's after the due diligence period of the contract or after the buyer's due diligence period here, meaning that time is expired? So the debate was, does the seller have to allow the inspection? It's past the due diligence period, inspection period. Or what happens if that inspection shows something and that warranty can now not be transferred? Who's responsible to do a potential repair or that kind of thing? So moral of the story is that if you represent a buyer, make sure, or seller, make sure that you're investigating these things, even if it's owned during your inspection and due diligence period. Because if it comes up after and something like that comes up, it could create some real challenges. And we had some real butting of heads on this last one on what happens if, and do I have to allow, the seller was, do I have to allow this inspection? Because I don't want to be responsible for that. So it became, is it new disclosure? I mean, there were so many things that came up. So does that all make sense to everyone? Yeah, no questions. Does anyone have any scenarios or questions about this form otherwise?
Well, how did that situation end if there was an inspection that needed to be done?
We're still waiting for the inspection to be done. I don't know that it's been completed just yet. We're getting close.
So by the owner of the panels, they're the ones that are doing the inspection?
Yes, the original company who installed them.
Okay.
And again, the panels, nothing changes with the buyer getting the panels. They own it. It's all good. It all came down to, does the warranty transfer in that case? So if it would have transferred to the new owner. So everybody at this point is kind of holding their breath and just hoping that inspection goes well. What Legal Hotline shared was that should the warranty inspection show something that needs to be repaired, it would fall more under potentially the buyer as a new disclosure. They may have the option to cancel in that 5 days, similar to you know, you're past your inspection period and the ceiling fan breaks. Now it's a new disclosure to the buyer. The buyer has 5 days to say, am I okay with that or not? Seller, maintain and repair. In this case, the Legal Hotline did not feel like the seller would be obligated to maintain and repair because it was something that should have been investigated during the buyer's due diligence period. So again, we're just praying that nothing comes up from that inspection. But
Shannon, I would
Yes.
mention to some of our newer agents and well-seasoned agents, solar's been around a long time, right? And Arizona sun is pretty brutal. So depending on when that solar system was installed, you know, if it was 20 years ago and it was a 20-year lease, it's probably out of warranty. You know, it may be, you know, you could probably be buying a box of bricks that, you know, you need to tear it all down, put a new one up, right?
Sure.
And because solar sits on existing roofs, and most of our inspectors love to put in their language that the roof is near end of its lifetime, and you're in that situation, you have to remove a complete solar system from the house. The roofer's got to, and that's usually done by the solar company. And then you have the roof replaced. I showed a house the other day. We actually wrote a contract on it. All the solar panels were stacked in the covered patio. And because of the rains and so forth that we've had, the solar company had to keep canceling their installation.
Mm.
So, I mean, solar's a really, interesting piece when it comes to contracts and warranties. And, I believe a lot of them that are owner paid, they don't have any maintenance program like a leased program has. So the borrower has to definitely understand what they're getting. What are they going to inherit here?
Right.
So.
Right. Because again, they taking those on and off, you may be damaging the roof or the underlayment of the integrity of the roof, that sort of thing. If there's repairs to just a panel,
Yeah, there's a comment from Kim. Our home warranty company is covering solar. I do not believe so. I don't think they'll ever want to touch that one. That's a big deal.
Yeah. And I don't know if solar companies offer like a warranty or a maintenance plan that you can buy separately. I'm not aware of that. It'd be nice if they did, so that a buyer could, potentially put something like that on a used or owned.
You also mentioned something about like this deal that you're dealing with, how the original solar company has to come out and do an inspection. A lot of the original solar companies are no longer in business.
Right.
There's a lot of companies that didn't make it through various stages of solar coming popular,
Or they've transferred, they've been bought out and they're a different company now, that kind of thing. And again, those warranties continue. That's why it's just so important on either end. If you're on the seller side, making sure the buyer is doing all that due diligence, so that it's not coming up later. And then on the buyer side, making sure you're investigating all of those things and making sure you have time to do that, because, they're all listed here, and pointing out each and every one of those and making sure buyers looking into all of those things is really important. So a couple comments. Monica, plus removal comment for roof repairs are needed after the fact again. And Kim says she has a vendor that does solar inspections. So that's great. And if there's an agent, Tara, what's her name? Sarah, help me. Do you remember Tara Rutledge?
The solar lady?
The
Yeah.
solar girl, Tara.
Yeah,
What
she's
is
good.
her last name? She is really good.
She is. If you guys ever see her classes come up about solar, I would highly recommend them. She is the guru.
Let's bring her in again. We brought her in before.
Yeah.
And we brought her in way back when we were in the basement on 7111. Long time ago.
Yeah,
we did, and we did it on Zoom too. A
Right.
couple years ago.
It's Tara Ratowski.
Thank you. I was trying to look her up.
Yeah,
Thank
well,
you, Donna.
she did my solar originally in my previous home. So
Yeah.
I'm friends with her. So yeah, she's very knowledgeable.
She is. She's become the go-to and questions about solar.
Donna,
How-
send that email to Sarah so we can maybe get her on our future class rotation.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Mary has her hand up.
Mary?
One problem I've seen come up with solar that totally took everyone off guard is the on an older home, a lot of times they're going to need a new roof or a new underlayment. And people aren't aware, number one, that the solar panels have to be removed when that happens. So it's going to be an additional expense and additional coordination of companies, because the solar company has to, if it's leased solar, the solar company has to come out and remove it themselves. And and then come out and put it back on once the new roof or underlayment is there. And I had one where the seller had used an unlicensed contractor to put new underlayment under their roof. And he even had pictures. This guy did such a great job, and for $5,000 less than the next, the other guy. And after closing, the roof in the master bedroom started leaking. I mean, the ceiling, there was a leak. And turned out the neighbor told the guy, the new owner, that when the roofer had been there, that he just went around the solar panels instead of going through taking them off and they're on again. He didn't do the new underlayment in that section. That was how he saved his money. But he was nowhere to be found. So the seller had to come up with money later to avoid litigation.
Yeah. Yeah. It can create a whole.
You get what you pay for.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an endorsement for using licensed contractors right there.
Right. But I mean, it had been, well, if it were years ago and it had been, when it had been done, isn't that licensed contractor addendum have a time limit? How far? 6 months?
Potentially, yes. I mean, the licensed contractor statute indicates that the seller, if they've done those repairs within the last 12 months with the intention of selling the property. So potentially, yes. It's still a disclosure, and you still have to just make the proper disclosures on those things. I don't know that it changes the requirement of the licensed contractor. It could, I guess, but that's a whole nother conversation.
So why they would come in and put solar panels on a roof that needed to be redone, obviously, is beyond me too.
Yeah.
Great. Shannon, you're at 9:58 right now.
All right.
And thank you, Kim. Kim put, if anybody wants to save that contractor's information for the solar inspector, she put that in the chat. So grab that real quick before we sign off.
Thank you for sharing that, Kim. Otherwise, other forms, if you guys ever have questions, just call me. We'll find out the answer. If I don't know, we'll find out. But all of these do have all these provisions that they really are intended to protect all parties. So, but they can be amended. And we've had recent situations where we addressed some of the language that was a concern depending on which side it was, and just adjusted it to fit those needs of the situation. So if you do have questions, always feel free to reach out if you're not sure.
Yeah, so two quick endorsements. Transaction coordinators. We have two amazing transaction coordinators that know their stuff. So just a quick plug for them. If you're not using one, I would encourage you to talk to Stephanie and Janice. And then next week we have the 23rd, we've got a great event on the calendar. It's in person at Arrowhead North. Title Alliance and Motto are putting on a breakfast for you guys. So check out the details on that. And that's it.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Shannon.
Have a great day, everybody.
Everybody have a great day. We'll talk to you later.